Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of the Responsible Edge podcast with me, Charlie Martin. The Responsible Edge is your go-to source for lessons in how to implement ethical and yet effective marketing. So today's show, I was delighted to be joined by Dominic Tantram of Terrafiniti, a sustainability consultancy based here in the UK. Dominic himself is a chartered environmentalist and fellow of the Institute of Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability, and he has over 25 years of experience working with some of the leading companies in the world, universities, WWF, WEF, and other NGOs, as well as the European Environment Agency and UK government departments. It's fair to say that what Dominic doesn't know about sustainability and corporate communications really is probably not worth knowing. So absolutely brilliant to have him join us today. In terms of our conversation itself, really we focused initially on the Havas and Shell controversy and looking at some of the unpicking that a little bit. We then went into looking more broadly at how to manage association risk when choosing to work with either clients or suppliers. We then talked a little bit about greenwash awareness and how to develop that within an organization. And then finally, Dominic left us with some really compelling and interesting advice for any junior marketeers out there looking to develop their careers. So hope you guys enjoyed the show. And as always, feel free to leave us a comment and get involved in the conversation. Perhaps, Dominic, would it be useful, or I think it would be useful for our listeners, if you just perhaps started by providing a bit of a summary of the situation that Havas have found themselves in with Shell regarding their appointment as the lead agency. So would you mind just providing a bit of an overview?
Okay, so this is all very much hot news at the moment. Havas have received criticism for a contract that they've recently signed with Shell. It's actually a media buying contract, and they've received a lot of flack for this. And it's actually quite a complicated situation because some of Havas's agencies, so they're a big group, they have different companies and agencies made up in them. And some of the agencies are B Corp members. One of the agencies actually signed up to Clean Creatives and their commitments to not working with oil companies. And also one of the agencies also had a contract, the non-fossil fuel proliferation treaty, it's a bit of a mouthful, which allegedly they've lost that contract as a result of this association. So they provide quite a good and current example of some of the challenges around who you work with, who you work with can lead you open to accusations of greenwashing, and what you might do about it, and what schemes like B Corp actually stand for. So a number of people have raised complaints about their B Corp membership as a result of this association. I should also point out that it's not a unique challenge for Havas. All the major agencies have an oil major, and Clean Creators have been pursuing campaigns against most of them, most notably recently also Edelman. And there's been some very hard-hitting campaigns against them. So yeah, there's a lot of can of worms tied up there, if I'm not mixing my metaphors too much.
That's awesome, Dominic. Yeah, that's a really, really good, summary of the situation. Diving straight in, though, from with your perspective and experience on how to navigate these things, what are the kind of key considerations that you think go into organizations, in this instance, agencies, choosing to either work with or not work with a prospective client?
So I think there's sort of decisions to be made and things to be clarified in sort of 3 or 4 key areas. So firstly, if we actually look at things like B Corp frameworks, or we go to, because a lot of work's been done, if you like, on this kind of area in ESG and SRI, socially responsible investment, has looked at this probably over the last 20 years. So they often begin with an exclusionary approach or a risk-based approach. So that might be a list of activities or industries or products that you sort of say these are no go, we won't work with these at all. Now, in actual fact, B Corp takes a subtly different version of that. It will actually uses a more risk-based approach. So it will say if you're a high risk agency, you get industry or activity, you get extra scrutiny rather than we won't engage at all, largely. But for some people, they might say tobacco, pornography, arms, we're not going to ever touch those. So that's the sort of the first filter, if you like, to sort of say, are there a set of things we're never going to touch under any circumstances? Now, interestingly, people also use thresholds. Now, that might come across as a bit of a get out, but the world's a complicated place. So let's say you say, well, we really don't like tobacco, we don't want to work with them. Do you work with a supermarket that sells tobacco or similar? So sometimes thresholds are used as a way around that. So you might say, well, look, if less than 5% of the business activity is related to this and it's not manufacture, it's just retail, then we'll let that go. We're prepared to live with that. So there's no right or wrong answers in this, of course. It's a question of finding out what, going through a process to decide what's right for you as let's say as an agency or a company in your engagement, where you feel comfortable, where that fits your values, your mission, your purpose, and what you want to do with it. But those are the first few steps. If you then potentially identified some people you will never work with or without the thresholds, then identified other areas which you might, if a number of things line up or meet some criteria, but you're going to give it some scrutiny. So it's high risk, but you're not going to dismiss it out of hand. You're going to consider it. The other things you then, I would argue, come into play are what is that company's capability and intention to change look like? Now, again, you can't put a number on that, but you can start to scrutinize. Okay, they're a high risk company, but they're genuinely moving on a transition to decarbonisation or away from the impacts that are problematic. And you can look at both their intention to do that in terms of stated aims, targets, leadership statements, etc., and a bit their capability to do that. Have they got the expertise? Have they signed up to frameworks? Where are they spending their money? So, for example, in the oil sector, there's an awful lot of data available on this. You can go and look at the capital expenditure of, let's say, Shell and see how much they're putting into their renewables and how much they're putting into new exploration or other business activities. So certainly for a publicly listed company, you can actually find some data to support that. So that gives you a feel for where they're going to change and their capability to change. And then the third main component is, what are you doing for them? And what is your ability to influence what you say and what you put in your campaign and the messages you're putting over? And have you got the capability to disengage if after discussion, argument, you haven't got to a position that you're happy with? So have you got an ability to say, actually, if this all goes the wrong way, as far as we're concerned, we're gonna exit? So those are the main things in play, I would suggest.
And Dominic, if you were to look at Havas and I mean, obviously we've kind of seen the I guess the end of the process in terms of the decision presumably they made to having gone through an analysis similar to the one that you've just described, and ultimately come to the conclusion that working with Shell on the basis that analysis was going to be okay in terms of a decision for them to move forward. Do you thinking about this particular example of Havas and Shell, etc., can you see how that analysis that you've just described there could have been done and the conclusion come to that working with Shell would be a positive, commercial decision?
From publicly available information, it's difficult to see how it could be defended in those terms. Mm-hmm. You have to remember that Havas is a big international group, and different decisions are made by different people in different places. The other challenge that someone like they have is we have to remember that sort of in the UK and Europe, we've got very different attitudes to oil than they might have, for example, in the Middle East. So if you're a company that also operates in the Middle East, it's socially much more acceptable to work with an oil company there than it is here. So we have different cultural norms to take into account as well. The arguments that Havas's CEO made were that they were going to use their power to influence Shell through the contract. That's been criticised by other people because it's a media buying contract and it looks like the scope for influence is small. There is also an argument as to whether a company like Shell is going to take strategic business direction advice from, however big and significant they are, but from a creative partner. And it's difficult to see that in that circumstance. Something smaller and more focused, like uptake of renewables, or let's say electric cars. There's a lot of myths around electric cars. I can see an awful lot of value that a communications expert and a creative agency could to tackling some of the sustainability challenges for uptake around things like that are much more tactical. So I could see some real value there with breaking through some of the misconceptions, where I think there's definite ability for positive change. So no, I think it's difficult. It's difficult. It's a difficult exercise to conduct from outside, but it's difficult to see from what's public how it could be justified across those criteria. And I mean the other part of that is it's in flux at the moment, but Shell, like some of the other oil majors, have stepped back a bit from their renewable strategies and are investing less money in them. Now there's a big change coming around now for Shell, but their current CEO seems to have stepped back a bit, and looking at their capex on renewables, it's around 5%. So difficult to make the argument that their transition is as fast as many of us would probably like to see.
And Dominic, that was really interesting. And I think, one of the kind of key takeaways perhaps from what you've just described there, when we're thinking about our listenership and listeners and thinking about what they can learn from that, is that the key is to have a framework and a process for the analysis that takes place in terms of those steps, that initial blacklist. We're not going to go anywhere near the following. And then there's more sort of contextually contingent analysis steps, if you like, of, right, do they hit this mark? Do they hit that mark? What are their intentions? What is our potential influence, etc.? That's a key kind of decision-making framework. Would you say for any organization, we're obviously talking within the creative industry, client dynamic, if you like, but essentially that's applicable to any organization choosing to work with any other organization, is it not?
I think it is. If you're concerned about the alignment with your values and the reputational risk, and the opportunities with other. So as we've seen with the Havas example, if let's say you're an environmental NGO with that example where allegedly they've lost the contract, they're saying we can't work with you if your parent group has made this decision. Now, commercially, that contract, who knows, but it's probably reasonably safe to assume is far, far lower value than the one with Shell. So could be ultimately they're not that bothered about that, but it remains to be played out, what the reputational damage and what the economic cost of this might be to them. But for different players, particularly if you're more niche and that's what you're specializing in, then it's arguably much more important for you. So yeah, you can't put numbers on most of these things, but I think it's important that you understand those sort of main moving parts. What's their risk? What's their capability of change, and what is it you're doing with them? And the relative balance of those things will make them more or less important. So let's say, for example, it's something that's very low risk, and you're probably not bothered what you're doing for them because they're a good company. They don't represent a risk to you or your reputation and in being associated with them. So you probably help them, within reason and within normal bounds of ethics and legality, do whatever they want to do. But if you start dialing up some of the other risk factors, then it matters more what you're doing with them, and perhaps whether you can argue that you are influencing them in something that matters. So yeah, it's a balance. In terms of a sort of system, I think having a systematic way of saying this is how you look at that you can then defend a decision with, and sometimes you might need to defend that decision with employees internally. So why did we say yes to this contract and no to that one? And be able to say, well, we ran it through this process, and this was the result. And the ability to talk to external customers about, having the same discussion, because it will come up.
And that was almost going to be part of my next question, Dominic. Like this is the process that we go through before making the decision to ultimately align ourselves with a particular supplier, client, whatever else it might be. Having made that decision from a Havas perspective, and having had this degree of backlash, if for a better word, what do they do next? What should they do to address or to mitigate against further issues around this? Is potentially being open and transparent about that process and the diligence that they went through to make their decision. Is that the sort of thing that they could potentially look to do?
So yeah, I think anyone in that situation, that is the way forward. So obviously transparency is an important component of ethics, to be honest, and trust. And in a broader sense in sustainability anyway, is an important sort of tenet of sustainability. I think in terms of they've got an issue in rebuilding trust, them and others in their industry in the same boat. I think part of that is confronting these issues and discussing them, not necessarily at first in public, but having established a position, discussing that position with the relevant range of stakeholders, and it has to be shining a light on it. And we need to have adult discussions about this, because it's a complicated, messy world out there, and it is very easy for clean creatives to take a very binary position. There's a lot of appeal to that. I think we can get behind what they're looking to achieve, but it's not possible for us to disengage from oil companies overnight. I think most of us are looking for a much faster, more dramatic transition. But just saying we can't engage with them is, well, it's fine for some people. If you want to do that, that's fine. But we need people to engage with them to push their behaviour on that transition. Mm-hmm. At the same time, if there are people outside holding them account, that's a really useful part of the system. But it's a messy world out there. We all eat food. We rely on pharmaceuticals. We use, even if we're not very keen on it, plastics are very important in a number of applications. We drive on roads. Everything is powered by fossil fuel at the moment. We need to move away from that, but we have to understand our part in that system, our complicity with a small c in that system. And as a result of that, there aren't any really, there's shades of grey, and we need to shine some light on that and be clear about our values, what we stand for, and why we're falling one side of a watershed when we make a decision. And the best way to do that is to examine the things that the decisions underneath that, whether they're ethical or otherwise, and how you've arrived at them, and why you've got to the position you're at, and that's much more authentic as well.
And specifically talking about greenwashing in the context of this, would you foresee a situation whereby if an organization was going to start working with another organization, that there were concerns around greenwashing and concern around the green credentials of the organization? Would it be a situation in which very specifically the agency in this example would just need to clarify up front the kind of their rules of engagement, if you like, in terms of the messaging that they will and won't be prepared to touch? Is that going to likely be part of kind of mitigating against the risk of, as an agency, therefore being aligned with greenwashing messaging?
It's certainly going to be part of it, but it might not be depending on the context, it might not be the whole picture. So, because if you imagine a scenario where you were able to very strictly compartmentalize what you did for that company, and there was no greenwashing happening in your direct involvement, but the wider reputation of that company was tarred from other activities. You've still got a potential risk by association, even if your hands specifically are completely clean of greenwash. So that's something you would need to bet you would take into account in your assessment. I would say.
Okay, that's very interesting. And when it comes to, and I will move on from kind of the agency client dynamic, if you like. But when it comes to, you mentioned the part of the initial analysis of whether or not you're going to work with the client would be looking at the opportunities that you felt that there were to kind of influence the practices of the client and of the business. What sort of form would that take? I mean, what does that look like in terms of in that pre-engagement before we choose to work together? Would there be kind of, would there be agreements at that stage of things that you might consider looking at together, or would it be very much more of an open book? Let's work together and look to influence over time. What does the nature of that kind of opportunity look like for an agency influencing their clients?
I think it could be either. It could be either of those ends, and it will depend upon the objectives of the client, I think. So obviously, sometimes it might be very campaign specific, and there's not much scope to broaden it out from that, or it could be much more developmental, and we want to help you. We want you as an agency to help us develop a responsible communications approach across the board. So there are sort of different scopes of engagement, and therefore different levels of conversation. If you have concerns and it's a sort of narrower engagement, then that will be something to raise in discussion, but you may or may not have the door open to you there. So again, I think the context is really important. But developing your capability and position to a point where you can say this is an area we can help companies with, and our professional responsibility is to pursue best practice here, and we're here to help you. And coming from that point of that position of service, I think is going to be increasingly valuable. And not everyone's going to be open to that, or they're going to be open to that in different degrees. But I think coming from that position of actually we're going to help just improve practice here and help you get ahead, pursue opportunities, reduce your risk by behaving like this and asking you these questions that are sometimes quite difficult, I think can only be useful and can only be valuable.
Can I ask, this is a very specific question here, but we just reflecting on actually a conversation that we'd had recently with an anti-greenwash charter signatory, who was talking about one of their key focuses in terms of their sustainability strategy was on supporting their supply chain in decarbonization initiatives, and essentially looking less further afield, if you like, in terms of offsetting, etc., and more looking at what influence can we play in helping to improve things across our supply chain. Do you, when you think about that, I mean, that's a different form of association. It's not a client supplier relationship from that end, but it's a supplier to client, almost the other way around. What are the nuances, if you like, between those two types of relationships that you think play out? And is there a greater opportunity in one or the other in terms of influencing change?
It's a really interesting question. So supplier relationships have always been an important part of sustainability performance in carbon and everything else. So of course, there's a lot of social risks potentially in supply chains. Again, depending on what you do, but certainly for manufacturers. So a lot of the classic reputational risk stories, narratives in sustainability have been from suppliers. So child labor in your supply chain, for example, if you're a clothing manufacturer, your factory collapsing on the people that make your clothes, that sort of thing. And it's an important part of not greenwashing as well, because an important part of best practice and sustainability is to focus on so-called material issues, the priority issues. And a classic greenwashing trope is to just focus on one or two issues and ignore perhaps some of the more complicated ones. So that, for example, is where Apple got a lot of flack with their Mother Earth video end of last year, by focusing almost entirely on carbon and not their other material issues, which are labour in their supply chain, use of minerals, mining impacts, toxics, etc. So carbon is important, but only amongst and against those other issues. So where they went wrong with that communication, arguably, was they didn't cover the other things you would expect them to cover if they're doing a communication on sustainability. If you take the example of carbon, typically many companies, perhaps up to 80% of their impact is in their scope 3, in the stuff they buy in their supply chain. So much of the work to reduce impact needs to look there. And it has the same similar dimensions but different for association risk. So if you're associated with a supplier that has a major issue, then that's a risk to you, in a similar way as if you're associated with a client that is doing something that's frowned on or nefarious, then you have a risk in that direction. Can it, just try and answer your question, certainly likely to be very significant in terms of impacts, yes. Context will determine, your particular situation will determine how important it is for you.
And out of interest, if we're now thinking about supply chain management, we're looking at influence over supply chain, does a similar framework as that you described at the beginning, that Havas, for example, would have likely gone through in order to evaluate the prospect of working with Shell, does a similar framework apply in choosing who your suppliers are going to be?
So it's a bit different because you're commissioning, you're buying. So theoretically, sort of slightly different nuances to the level of control you have. Although, unless you're a massive company, your level of control might be relatively low. Best practice also follows a risk-based approach. So where we've worked with companies with sort of global supply chains to build their capacity and sustainable procurement, best practice is to move beyond a policy-based approach to a risk-based one. So therefore, you move beyond just getting everyone to sign up to your supplier terms and conditions, which is a good first step, but it doesn't tell you very much about performance. All it tells you is that they've signed something and promised to meet some standards. It doesn't tell you whether they actually do meet the standards. Is then to look at issues, whether it's the product or service you're buying represents a risk, whether the nature of it is risky. So, for example, agricultural products are nearly always high risk, and they might be different to other types of commodity. Does the location you're buying from represent a risk? So, let's say Vietnam, for example, is a relatively high risk area. So you might have some geographic filters to that. And in those higher risk areas, you basically give them more attention and you apply higher, if you can, tests to try and guarantee performance. So you might audit them or use a third party to audit them. So if you're concerned about working conditions for garment manufacturer in Vietnam, you might ask them to sign up to a third party verified scheme and or send in third party auditors to check that people are working the right hours, haven't got their passports locked in a safe, are able to talk to each other, have toilet breaks, can form join unions, etc. All the other sort of things like International Labour Organization measures, and there are a number of other standards and measures out there you can use and adopt. But those are the sort of ways you would systematically go through that if you were large enough and that worked for you. But the principles apply. Tier them up by risk, put more scrutiny on higher risk areas that's more likely to guarantee the things that the standards you're looking for them to meet.
And Dominic, and I think you've alluded to this a few times in this call, which I think has been a really realistic way of obviously looking at things, suggesting the complexity and the muddy, if you like, nature of the world that we live in, the complexity of the world that we live in. When it comes to communicating as an organization about the relationships that you have, and being sympathetic, I guess, to the fact that we don't have ultimate control over the third parties. We've implemented a clear process for choosing who we align ourselves with, but ultimately we have a jurisdiction, if you like, that ends at this particular point. What are your key strategies or considerations when you're looking to advise clients at Terrafiniti about how they go about the communication side of this? How do they go about communicating on behalf of, or to endorse in some way, their partners in light of these sustainability issues?
So it's actually quite simple. So your whole approach should be centered around taking this material approach, this jargon, a bit of jargon I've used. So materiality is should be a key bedrock of a good sustainability approach. So focusing on the things that are important and are priorities to you in terms of impact on you as a business and to your stakeholders involved in your business activities that are impacted by your business activities. And that should be done across the entire value chain of your product and service. If you hold to that core principle, in terms of that dictates what you should manage, and you haven't always got control over these things. Sometimes you've only got influence. In some cases, you've only got a level of concern. So we often use these simple filters of level of control, influence, and concern. And sometimes there's not much you can do about some of it, but be realistic about that. Take a risk-based approach, take a priority-based approach. If you stick to those are the main things we should be dealing with in our business, in our industry. Here's how we're managing them. This is what we're doing about it. Best practice also requires that you set long-term targets on those, and then over time disclose your performance against those things that are important over time. And that's then reflected in your communications with a good level of honesty and transparency. Then that's going to give you a very core, powerful narrative of how we're responding to sustainability and why. And if you're covering the things that are important, like arguably Apple didn't in that communication I mentioned, then you're removing areas of possible criticism because you're covering the things that matter. And that should be your core approach. It should be reflected in how you communicate about that agenda. We're covering the stuff that's important. It matters. This is how we're doing on it. We're doing less well on this issue than we hoped because of X, Y, and Z. We're changing our tack and trying. Next year we're going to take, because we haven't moved so well forward on that, we're going to try a different tack. So taking that mature adult approach, we've done really well in this other area. We've exceeded our targets. So the mixed balance of messages is authentic. Mm-hmm. Takes away any sort of gotchas as well, because you're not really anything. And it takes a sort of, we use the word adult. It does take, that can be hard doing that.
Let me ask. This might be a silly question, so forgive me if it comes across as such, and obviously our listeners, forgive me if this comes across as such. But let's say that if I was to sort of feedback, being thorough and being considerate of all aspects of your position, essentially, as an organization when it comes to sustainability issues is the key. Is what you've just described. What happens in a situation whereby we've done that, and yet we want to create a creative campaign or an advertising campaign that's focused around one particular area that we happen to be particularly strong in? We haven't not covered in our other materials, our other campaigns, the other elements, but we've just chosen to highlight a particular area that we feel that we're strong on. What implications does that have? Because from somebody who hasn't fully informed themselves about all the other messages and creative campaigns that you've delivered, you could look at that and go, oh, you're just focusing on that area that you're particularly strong in, but what about X, Y, and Z? But if you inform yourself, you actually understand that they have covered those other areas, but maybe just not as predominantly. So what's your take on that particular scenario?
So that's a really good point. And it's quite a common one that comes up. I think I would suggest that it needs somewhere needs a small reference to the other issues or areas of activity, not necessarily any sort of detail, but there needs to be a little back reference to that. So it might be, we're going to talk all about carbon here and decarbonisation. It's very important. It's one of the 5 core issues that we're responding on. So there's that sort of comment reference somewhere. That sort of thing would just help provide that little placeholder. In terms of the overall balance of the communications, the messages it's putting out, and the much more sort of helicopter strategic look at it, you need to just sort of pass that smell test of, is it fundamentally, is this ending up being a little bit skewed and a little bit misleading as a result of it, or actually is it balanced in the whole thing? So somebody needs to take a view on that. Are we really banging our drum too much in this area when we're not doing quite so well in the other? And could that give rise to someone who's a bit skeptical about it, thinking we're misleading them? So you just have to ask yourself that question as a sort of balancing question.
And I love that notion of a smell test. Is that whiff of does this have any sense of insincerity or focus on precluding other things that are equally as important, etc. Dominic, let me ask you a question. When it comes to greenwashing, or in fact, to be honest, any form of kind of over-optimistic misinformation that an organization might share across the board in terms of its sustainability credentials, what's your take on that slightly awkward relationship, if you like, between we have a marketing or a communications function within an organization which is geared towards achieving particular like commercial outcomes of growth, sales, etc., and therefore has a proclivity to wanting to be optimistic, perhaps in terms of use of messages and use of sustainability reports to position an organization in a certain way, versus the potential longer term detrimental impact of potentially being over optimistic or potentially misleading, and then what that does to your brand's reputation moving forward. What's your take on that relationship, that slight sort of issue around the marketing function and what it's trying to achieve? And equally, what is the way, what in your experience, what are the cultural norms or the governance norms that enable that issue to be addressed? Long question, sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. And again, a really good one. There's always a balance between long term and short term. And interestingly, there's a global crisis of trust that it is well illustrated actually by the work that Edelman do with the trust barometer. And again, they're a lovely example because they're also up on billboards that Clean Creatives have put up, criticizing them for their role in working with oil companies. It can be, people are getting, because there's been a lot of greenwashing amongst a lot of other misleading communications from businesses, governments, and other sectors of society. People are generally getting a bit more cynical. It's quite erosive about communications, and I think if you end up reinforcing that, you're sort of getting in a bit of a death spiral. So I'd argue that the only way to rebuild or continue to hold trust, if you have it, is to be fundamentally responsible. There can be a tension between commercial objectives and that sticking to an entirely truthful direction, an honest direction. and the mix will always be the right one for you in a particular circumstance. But I would always come down on the side of people are going to believe you if you're authentic and accurate, and that in the long run is going to be much more valuable than the marginal gain of using slightly different language in the shorter term, to be honest. That's what's going to get you people coming back and staying to you. I think there is a creative challenge. I think there's a creative challenge to this. When we advise people on making communications that are compliant with the Green Claims Code, tends to revolve around being much more specific, much more nuanced, in some ways reining claims in a bit. So going from our product is sustainable, which is difficult to justify, to our product has a reduced water or carbon footprint, and this is how it does it kind of message, is a creative challenge. I understand that. I think it's interesting though that there's a lot of opportunity there. So I think the best agencies will find more exciting ways of talking about that, communicating that, expressing that will still give them the edge while not greenwashing. So yeah, there's some tensions there, but there's the regulators in terms of both greenwashing communications, but actually also formal financial and non-financial disclosure. So formal disclosing mechanisms, but also the less formal communications and the regulations from the ASA and the CMA in the UK. They're all pushing the same direction of insisting that they've got to be accurate and truthful and substantiated. So there's a bit of a pincer movement going on. So while there's still a lot of bad practice and practice that perhaps arguably breaks those guidelines, certainly the space for a responsible company to do that has disappeared. There are still irresponsible, or I should be careful using that word. A lot of the stuff that doesn't comply is unintentional.
Dominic, can I ask you on that front? Is it unintentional because of that creative challenge that you've just described, i.e., that people are just not coming up with other ways of being able to communicate these messages effectively, and therefore that's where the unintended consequence of that is that ultimately things are misleading or ambiguous or whatever it might be, versus there's a CEO of a company who is pushing hard on their marketing or comms function in order to achieve a certain level of growth, and essentially is sort of encouraging them, for a better word, to ultimately be over optimistic, perhaps be less clear in terms of exactly the messages that they're using.
So I can only go off personal experience, because a lot of this comes down to internal stuff you don't see externally, and in large companies you don't necessarily see. So I have to be careful. And because we're a small business, we've worked with a relatively small number of customers. So what we see isn't the whole picture. Interestingly, the only time we've been uncomfortably pushed to help put out, which we said no to, but uncomfortably pushed to push out an over positive message, was actually by a government agency.
Interesting.
Not a UK one, but it was a government agency, not a commercial one. I think largely, so I think that does happen, but I think largely it's unintentional, and it's ignorance is a loaded word and is probably too strong, but it falls into just not quite understanding A, the regulations, and B, even when understanding the regulations, quite what is the right maybe evidence to back something up with. I think part of that's down to sort of culture between science and arts as well, a bit. I mean, there's a bit of a generalization, but increasingly, I mean, we're just doing a bit of work for a customer to give them guidance on evidence, actually, because we looked at a range of communications and provided some feedback, and quite a lot of those lines of feedback were, this claim's fine if you've got the evidence for it, and that repeated a number of times in the piece of work. So after a week or two gap, the question then came back, what evidence do we need? Give us some help with the evidence. And again, that's interesting because that's quite complicated. It's a very simple question. It's quite difficult to answer. What is good evidence? So the first thing people often jump to, well, can I look at something on an article on the internet? Well, maybe, but if it's effectively a sort of magazine level article, it's unlikely. It might have some good evidence. It's unlikely to give you enough information about it for you to be able to tell whether it's good evidence or not. And of course, there are a lot of things that are commonly followed but don't have evidence for or don't have proof for, which could get you in trouble ultimately with the regulator if there's a complaint about it. So one of the things that sort of come across my desk recently is the claim that house plants purify the air. This makes a good example. If you go and Google air purifying plants, you will find a number of quite reputable brands using that term, using that slogan. And they seem to point to a study that NASA did, looking at the role that plants can play in cleaning toxins out of the air. Now, NASA are a reputable organization, unless you're a conspiracy theorist, in which case they really don't seem to like NASA, but they're a reputable organization. So people will say, but well, surely that's a reputable source because NASA's a reputable source. Now, the challenge with this, when you go and look at the underlying bit of evidence, is the relevance of that bit of evidence to the claim that these guys want to make with their houseplants. And NASA were looking, as you might expect, they're interested in cleaning the air inside very small sealed environments, i.e. spacecraft. And their work showed there was a potentially useful effect coming off these plants. The problem is that doesn't apply to a room like this, where they are having an effect, but it's dwarfed by the volume of air throughput that comes through in a domestic environment. So my plant, you can't see my plants. I've got quite a lot of plants because I like plants. They are cleaning the air, but not at a level that makes any difference to my health sitting here or anyone else. So that claim can't be backed up by that piece of evidence. So that's I've just taken.
Crucially, it's the interrogation of that evidence that determines that that's the case, not just simply the acceptance that there is evidence. It needs to be the interrogation of the evidence.
Yeah. So in that case, it was a good bit of evidence, but not for that claim. It'd be fine if you were selling people plants to put in their spacecraft.
Perhaps a new business venture. Dominic, that was super helpful. I think in terms of, from our listeners' perspective, being able to go into not just looking at kind of mitigating risk in terms of association, both in terms of client or supplier relationships, but equally in terms of some of the strategies and suggestions that you've gone through with us today in terms of how to go about managing your comms and your sustainability strategies and organization has been super helpful. I could ramble on with you all day. We do, though, like to finish each of these episodes by asking you just one question on what is your kind of best bit of advice you could offer to a junior marketeer or a junior comms professional starting their career? What would be in your experience, number one bit of advice you'd offer to them to adopt as they look to develop themselves?
Well, if we sort of still stick in this sort of greenwashing realm, I think it would be try and take a step back, be slightly dispassionate. If you're looking at whether it's an engagement or a piece of work or a specific claim, and sort of say and ask yourself, well, what if I was a critical NGO or journalist looking at this? Would I be able to pick any holes in this? And overall, is this, if it's a claim, is it clear, accurate, and substantiated? Those are the key things to think about. But I think to answer the question more directly, more widely, just be curious, have an inquiring mind. Don't be negatively skeptical, but be critical with a small c. Be curious, push the boundaries on things, ask questions about accepted wisdom, challenge, this is the way we do things. in a soft way, not an aggressive way, but yeah, have an inquiry and critical outlook on things, and that will be really, really useful.
Develop, as may I say, develop your smell test.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Brilliant. Dominic, thank you so much. That was whistled by. Lots more I imagine we could go into, and imagine we'll be pitching that we might get you back for a further episode to delve into another topic. But thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
That's great. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, Charlie.